Welcome to the NBA Trades podcast. I'm your host, Raphael, and today I have a special guest. He is a columnist, writer, and editor at the Daily Memphian. It's Chris Herrington. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So, I had you on to talk about the Marc Gasol trade, the changes in the Grizzlies. But first, I wanted to learn a little bit about you. How did you get involved in journalism and was covering the NBA, writing about the Grizzlies or any NBA team, was that something that you had thought about early on in your life?
No, I came in the side door both ways, both in journalism broadly and in the NBA specifically. I sort of got sidetracked in college. I ran my college radio station and was the music editor of my college newspaper, and just got sidetracked writing record reviews for alt weeklies in the Twin Cities where I went to college. And next thing I knew, I was a music editor for the alt weekly in Memphis, which is where my hometown after I moved back home. And so never really planned it. It just sort of happened. So I ended up being the music and then the film editor of the alt weekly in Memphis, but was a huge NBA fan. I was probably one of 15 people in Memphis who was an obsessive NBA fan before Memphis had an NBA team. So when the Grizzlies moved to Memphis, I was, an arts writer, an arts editor for an alt weekly, and I decided to start doing a blog on the Grizzlies, basically as a hobby column, as sort of a side gig, just it's an extension of being a fan. And it just sort of developed a following. And from there, it sort of one thing led to another. The NBA thing had always been sort of a secondary thing for me until pretty recently. For a long time, I did it as a sideline to being a music and film writer for the Alt Weekly. And then about 6 years ago, I moved over to the Daily paper here in Memphis, where I was the arts and entertainment editor at the Daily. And I did a weekly column on the Grizzlies, sort of in the spirit of the blog I'd been doing for the Alt Weekly. I became a general columnist at the Daily, writing a daily column on sort of all things Memphis, and still doing sort of the weekly NBA thing. And when the Daily Memphian launched last year, which is a nonprofit digital only Memphis news site that we launched about a year ago, less than a year ago, that's really the first time that covering the Grizzlies became not the only thing I do, but the primary thing I do. And so I sort of happened into it, really.
Oh, wow. So I also saw you have a blog that you do, make lists and write about music still, called Sing All Kinds. So for you,
Yeah, that's a
oh,
total high. I don't even
yeah.
like. I tweet those out, but I don't expect anyone to actually read it. That's like a hobby thing for me, because I was primarily a music critic, music writer for a long time, and I don't really do that much anymore. So I do it just sort of on the side as a personal outlet.
Yeah. Is for you, what music do you find yourself like really listening to right now at this stage, right now?
Well, it's funny. I mean, you mentioned that blog I do, and I do that blog as sort of, I wanted to give myself a reason. Now that I'm not writing about new music regularly, I'm trying to re-listen to basically everything like it's ever been released that matters, like my entire record collection, and then stuff that now you can easily find on Spotify that I just never got around to listening to. So I've been picking random years and just listening to stuff from those years, sort of as an exercise. So right now I'm listening to music from 1979 and 1989, and so Fear of Music by Talking Heads was in my car recently, and Don't Tell a Soul by The Replacements, which is 89, I just listened to. So I got a bunch of 1979 and 1989 records and CDs thrown about at the moment.
Oh, wow. So you go all over from different years, in terms of music. Um,
Yeah,
yeah. As I'm guessing you're probably a record collector too, right? Do you collect music and
I
like go to
I'm
record
a
stores?
I consider myself a music collector. Like, I care about having physical copies of things I care about, but I don't care about whether something is collectible or expensive or first pressing. I don't care about any of that. I care about I care about physically owning the music I want to listen to. Like, if I care about something, I want a physical copy on a shelf somewhere. I don't particularly care whether it's vinyl or CD or whether it's rare or not. But I do. Like, I did a big shopping run actually during the All-Star break. I wanted to get away from basketball, and I actually went to Nashville for the day and traded a bunch of stuff and did about $300 worth of trade and got, like, a Louis Armstrong box set and the American Epic box set, which was the PBS series of early American music, and found a Captain Beefheart record I didn't have before. And so I'm a collector of physical music, but I wouldn't call myself a record collector.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, I mean, looking at, I guess, trying to segue into the Grizzlies thing. So they made a big trade, getting Marc Gasol, or giving up Marc Gasol after a long time, and it sort of signified the end of the Mike Conley, Marc Gasol, partnership. How they relied on those two along with Zach Randolph and Tony Allen, during the previous grit and grind era. For you, what did it mean to you, just sort of seeing like that trade happen, and sort of just the emotional impact, because it feels like with Marc Gasol, he has such a deep ties to Memphis, going to high school here when Powell was playing for the Grizzlies, and just sort of how long he's been in Memphis for a really large part of his life and his NBA career, obviously his whole NBA career being in Memphis.
I sort of characterize the whole thing as a kind of long goodbye, both within this season and then over the course of multiple seasons. I mean, I feel like a lot of us, myself included, sort of eulogized the grit and grind Grizzlies like while they were still playing, because you never knew when it was going to end. Like there was after a few years, there was always, well, Zach's contract's up. Is he gone now? Is Tony's contract's up? They all went through these periods where their contracts were coming up, and maybe they were leaving, and maybe this was the last season. And so I think there was a lot of like eulogizing that while it was going on. And then, obviously it's been 2 years since Zach and Tony have been gone. And so depending on how you define the era may have already been over. I sort of thought of it in terms of those four players and their interactions with each other. And so as long as there were at least a couple of them there, you still had that sense of interaction. And so to me, even with Conley remaining, when Gasol left and Conley was the last one of the four, it was finally officially fully over. But it got to the point where I think Gasol was ready. In fact, I'm pretty sure Gasol was ready to go. I think most fans had gotten to the point where, it was bittersweet, but it was time to turn the page and sort of move towards the future. And so, it wasn't like some sudden ending. I mean, the playoff run had ended. We're already a year and a half removed from the playoff run. Tony and Zach had left. You could tell Gasol was antsy and sort of ready to move on at this point. For another, he'd be gone this summer, even though he had a player option. And so it was bittersweet, but it wasn't. I think a lot of people, fans and players and everyone included, was ready to sort of, break the cord and then move on a little bit with it.
Yeah, and it's funny, like it felt like he was ready. I mean, not for me, like I spoke to him last year for a story I did for Bleacher Report. It was a story about the 10-year anniversary of the Pau Gasol and Marc Gasol trade, and just sort of, brothers getting traded for each other. And I spoke to him and Marc Gasol and Chris Wallace for the story. And when I did I asked him around, it didn't end up in the story just because it didn't fit, but I asked him about sort of his future with the Grizzlies. They were bad last year, and so they were headed for, what they ended up being, a lottery team getting Jaren Jackson. And I asked him about like his future and if he sees it sort of ending in the way that Powell's time in Memphis ended, with him wanting a trade. And he said he would never like demand a trade, but he also said that it is different in that sense, that he wouldn't demand a trade, but that whatever happens. And so for me, I always took that as he was ready for whatever to happen, like in terms of being traded. And it felt like this weird, like calm sense of whatever happens. That sort of threw me off when I was speaking with him, because he just sort of was like, if they get a good return for me, I'm happy for them in that sense. And you never really hear players talk like that. So.
Well, that's funny, because I had a very similar conversation with Marc, I don't know, a month and a half ago, something like that, before it became public that the Grizzlies were looking to trade him. And it was a similar conversation, but it was in the context of the Grizzlies this season, Jaren Jackson Jr. on the team. And I asked Marc, at that point, it didn't seem like the Grizzlies were necessarily looking to trade him, and so maybe it was going to head to the summer. There was this question of player option and all of this, and I asked Marc, is there any way you would ask for a trade in season ahead of the deadline? And he was like, of course not. He sort of said, that's something that I don't want to even think about during the season. We'll deal with it in the summer. And I think part of his annoyance was that he didn't think he was ready to go, but he sort of wanted to wait till the summer at one point. And so he said, like, he sort of dismissed the idea that he would ask for a trade. And I said to him, well, it's happened before, and it's happened with the Gasol. Like, you remember this, right?
Yeah.
And he sort of paused for a second. It was funny. He said, that's funny because it's sort of a similar situation because when Powell left, Rudy was the new guy coming in, and now it's Jaren, and like he drew the parallel between Powell's exit and his exit before it happened without me even really quite prompting it. The idea that Marc had a longer, better run with the Grizzlies, but Powell was here for the first playoff stretch for the franchise in Vancouver or Memphis. They'd had 3 playoff seasons, and then they had fallen out of the playoffs, and they had sort of entered a rebuilding mode, and they had gotten this exciting young player in the lottery, Rudy Gay's rookie season, and Powell got traded in the middle of the season. Post-playoff run was sort of the new standard bearer in place. Now, it ended up Rudy Gay was not the standard bearer, but at the time they thought he was. And Marc saw the parallel between that and him this season with you're out of the playoffs, the playoff run has ended, you're in a rebuilding phase, even though you haven't totally gotten rid of the old players, and now there's the new guy. Jaren Jackson is the new Rudy Gay, and everyone hopes the better Rudy Gay as sort of the new standard bearer for the organization. And so when I talked to Marc, he drew that parallel himself, and that was before it became public that the Grizzlies were interested in trading him, when at least at that moment, I thought it would probably wait till the summer, and he did too at that moment, but he volunteered that parallel himself to me.
Yeah, and that's sort of the interesting thing about it is just that he realized that this might have run its course, and I mean, of course it did, so he ended up moving on. But I guess for the future of the Grizzlies, they were so connected to him and the identity of this, physical team, and this style of play that sort of did fit Marc because he's not the fastest big man out there. So the way they played also did sort of fit the way that he would play as a half-court player.
Well, I would turn it around. I would say that he in a way dictated their style of play more than anyone else. Because it's not just that he is physically slow, it is that to me he likes to hold the ball. He likes to look for the right pass. He likes to sort of the shot clock is Marc Gasol's enemy. I think in the absence of the shot clock, he would just keep passing the ball in pursuit of the perfect moment as long as he could, right? Like Gasol is not a quick trigger kind of player for the most part. He's a guy who likes to it takes him a while to get down the floor, but then he will pass up the good in pursuit of the perfect, sometimes to his detriment. And I just think you can't have Marc Gasol as the fulcrum of your team and not be a slow team, pace-wise. I just think we'll see what happens in Toronto, but he's off the bench playing 20 minutes, right, so far. But when he's the fulcrum and he's number 1, number 2 in touches, I guess number 2 to Conley probably on this team, I just think with Marc Gasol as the fulcrum of your team, you will be a slow-paced team. Which is not necessarily bad. I mean, that's not qualitative. They were a slow-paced team, and they were in the playoffs 7 years in a row. But I do think Gasol sort of dictated the style of play in a way that was sort of almost natural and not strategic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Do you think that that's going to lead to them changing their style of play, especially with Jaren Jackson Jr., who's a much more different kind of big man?
I think the canvas is blank going into next season, because I don't think Jaren Jackson dictates the style of play. I think you can play almost any kind of style in terms of pace, half court, whatever. I think Jaren Jackson can play. He has this season. He's much better as a post player already than I think anyone anticipated. So I think you can play half-court basketball with Jaren Jackson, but you're not locked into that at all with him, especially if you move him to center down the line, and I think that will quicken things up. I do think it is underrated how much Mike Conley also contributes to a slower pace. I mean, there was some thought locally of, hey, like now Conley's finally free, you're going to see the speedy Mike Conley up and down the floor, and I think maybe it wouldn't have been this way early in his career, but at this stage, I think there's a muscle memory of sort of patient half-court basketball with him. And so I almost think Conley sort of influences a slower pace too. But I think there's a good chance they're going to trade Mike Conley this summer. And so I think if you do that, you have a total blank canvas style-wise going into next season, especially if you end up with a new coach, which I think is possible as well.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the interesting part of the Grizzlies. While it's clear that they're going under a rebuild, it's very unclear, like, besides Jaren Jackson Jr., who else is going to really be a part of the future that you could see down the
Right.
road. And I mean, they have some interesting pieces, like the pieces they got in the Marc Gasol trade, like DeLon Wright and Jonas Valanciunas, CJ Miles, and that 2024 second round pick. What do you think would be the best way for the Grizzlies to go about their rebuild, or is it still so unclear because we don't really know who really is going to be a cemented part of the future of this franchise besides probably one player?
I think I want to say the lottery is May 14th. I think I could answer that question a lot better on May 15th. I think that's going to determine a lot. The Grizzlies could have anywhere from the first pick in the draft to no pick at all, because of what they owe to Boston. And so I think that the first domino is going to be the lottery, and that the second domino is Mike Conley, and the first domino may impact the second. And so they're in a really tricky situation because they're entering a rebuild with two anchors tied around their neck. One, they owe a first round pick to Boston that they will convey sometime in the next 3 summers. And two, they have $24 million of cap tied up in Chandler Parsons going into next season. And so I think they put them, so the good side is they have Jaren Jackson Jr., so they have a cornerstone, I think in place going into this rebuild, but they don't have any other, as you point out. There's no one else on the roster you would feel really confident if you're even 2 years from now. And then they have those two sort of anchors that are really going to hurt them in terms of pivoting towards the future. And so, I mean, I think at this point, everything has to be about how you maximize Jaren Jackson Jr. and what works around him. If you get the number 1 pick in the draft, that conversation changes because now, it sort of depends on what happens with the draft pick. It may be that after lottery night, you say you have 2 cornerstones that you hope, in theory in place, and now you're working around 2 players. But right now it's about 1. And like we just said, Jaren Jackson Jr. does not dictate a particular style. I don't think it's clear positionally what he is. I think the conventional wisdom in the NBA is he's a center. I think the Grizzlies' attitude when they drafted him was he may be a center, but he's not yet. And I think that is proven correct this season. I think he is versatile enough that you're probably thinking about what types of players from a skill set perspective work best with him instead of locking into he's a center, he's a 4, he's a 5. I think he's just a big, and it's a matter of what fits best skill wise. And as good as he is, I think probably not, if you're going to be a perennial playoff team, he may not be your best player because it's such a perimeter oriented league, even though I think he is sort of, he has high level skills potentially as perimeter big. Like your offensive alpha dog is probably going to have to be somebody in the backcourt or on the wing, and that player's not here yet. And so I think the road ahead for the Grizzlies is extremely murky.
Yeah, and I think there are definitely a lot of questions about it. I think with also the management side of things, it always felt like they've been connected also to the grit grind. Like they wanted to keep that type of style of play because of how it's connected to the fan base and how people were interested in the Grizzlies. Probably the peak interest of the Grizzlies has been while they've played grit and grind. Is management, do you think management is ready to move away from that identity and sort of try something new? Or do you think that they're still stuck on that because that could drive ticket sales and drive things like that? In terms of just having that old school identity and keeping that tradition alive?
I think it's true that grit and grind has become something of a rhetorical crutch for the organization, both basketball and business side. How much it is like an actual crutch that you cling to once you fully switch over your roster, I think remains to be seen. I suspect that it won't be. I think they tried to sell that this year because they happened to draft Jaren Jackson Jr. They thought he was the best player on the board, and he happened to be a guy who people thought was going to be a defense-first player. I think that has actually changed a little bit. He's been way ahead of schedule offensively. But you drafted him, he was sort of profiled as a defense-first player, right? You didn't draft him because he was a defense-first player. You drafted him because he was the best player available. But then once that's the guy you have, then it's easy to slip into, we're returning to the grit and grind defense. Look, we got this future defensive player of the year. I think if they had the 5th pick, they probably would have taken Trae Young, right? And then just sell him in a different way. And so I think in a lot of ways, the sales job followed just a basketball decision that was independent of all of that. I suspect that they will be willing to pivot fully away from that kind of thing going forward I also think, and I don't want to get too far down the road, and this is speculation, but I think there's a pretty decent chance there are different decision makers as the Grizzlies go into this rebuild, at least to some degree.
Yeah, that's always sort of been a question with the Grizzlies throughout, I guess you would say, pretty much since Robert Pera has been owner of the team, and just sort of the questions of who is going to be running the show, and how that talk always sort of rises to, regarding that team specifically.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, no one knows. No one except for Robert Pera, if he even knows exactly what's going to happen. Robert Pera being the controlling owner of the team, and someone who's, mysterious is sort of the wrong word, but certainly sort of an introverted kind of presence. He's not someone who is out in the media a lot, sort of proclaiming what he thinks about things. He sort of keeps to himself and within the organization. So no one but him knows what the future holds, but the feeling in Memphis is, I think there's a lot of fan discontent with basketball management. And I don't think you should make decisions catering to that, pandering to like fan anger or fan discontent. But I think there has been ample reason to feel like the Grizzlies need a change in basketball leadership. And I think it's gotten to the point now where if there's a basketball rationale, and a lot of people think there's now a business rationale. I think the basketball leadership has become a business problem for the franchise. And whether Robert Pera takes that into account, I don't know, but it's a real thing.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting to me with the Grizzlies is sort of like, there's so many players who it feels like there's an audition for this, the rest of this year, from, veterans like Avery Bradley having only $2 million guaranteed on his contract next year. And, to the younger guys like, Bruno Caboclo, who they signed for the rest of the season. What are you most interested to see in these remaining, 30-ish or I guess, high 20-ish, games left in the season?
23 games.
Okay. I'm off.
Friday night. As we speak, they're a few hours from tip against the Clippers. So it'll be 23 games, including that one. Jaren Jackson Jr. is always at the top of anything with the Grizzlies, just sort of, you still want to see him as much as you can. And with Gasol gone, it's a chance for, you've already seen it a little bit, but it's a chance for Jackson to step up into the pecking order in terms of touches and shots and minutes. And so you want to see that. Beyond that, I think, and we're not going to see this in the game that's happening tonight, because Jonas Valanciunas, who they acquired from Toronto, is not back yet. He went to Lithuania over the break and has not returned. They're hoping to have him back soon. And Jaren Jackson is actually listed as questionable with a quad issue. But they've got, 20-something games to decide how well they think Jaren Jackson Jr. and Jonas Valanciunas fit together. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I think Jaren Jackson is a potentially great player. I think Jonas Valanciunas is a good player. Do they work together? Is that a good look for a starting front court for next season? I have no idea, and that's something the Grizzlies need to try to find out. Valanciunas has a player option next year, so the decision sort of starts with him. But for the Grizzlies, I mean, do they want to think about offering him an extension off of that? Do they want to think about enticing him to opt out and sign a new contract for multiple years at a lower salary figure? Do they want to just, let him make his own decision and not commit beyond next season? That's a decision they have to make, and I think part of that is about trying to figure out whether Jackson and Valanciunas works together in the short term. DeLon Wright, who they got in the Gasol trade, he'll be a restricted free agent, assuming that they extend the qualifying offer, which I'm sure they will. He'll be a restricted free agent. They have a decision to make there. Like, what is he worth to them in terms of a multi-year offer? Like, what do they think he is? Is he just a backup point guard? Is there a chance if they trade Mike Conley that I don't think anyone thinks he's the point guard in the future, but is there a chance he's a transitional starter? Like let's say, for instance, you jump up in the draft and you draft John Moran or Darius Garland, right? And you trade Mike Conley. Could DeLon Wright be the bridge from Mike Conley to whoever the real point guard of the future is? And is he worth a 3 or 4 year deal, to be that kind of player? I think there's a decision to make there. You mentioned Avery Bradley. I think they'll try to include him in some kind of trade package in the summer. That's probably unlikely to happen, in which case they have to decide, do we bring him back for $12 million or do we let him walk for $2 million? If he's the player that he was in Los Angeles the first half of this season and the second half of last season, that's a very easy decision to make.
Yeah.
But he's been good so far. Like so far, in 3 or 4 games with the Grizzlies, he's looked more like the Detroit or Boston Avery Bradley. And so if that's what he is for the rest of this season, and you think that's what he is going forward as a 28-year-old, do you tell yourself, hey, you bring him back, he's a good player for us, and then he's a $12 million expiring contract at next year's deadline? Like, do you talk yourself into that? Probably not, but it's at least a maybe, right? And then there are other young players that are already here. You have some decisions to make. Do you think Javon Carter can play? Do you think Ivan Rabb can be in your rotation as a backup big? One of the bad things is Dylan Brooks is out for the season and Kyle Anderson is out for the moment, and I suspected he may end up being out for the season. And if you have to, and those are probably the 2 players after Jaren Jackson who are most likely to be part of a core. And so if you play out the season without either of those 2 guys, then that's a little bit of a bummer.
Yeah, it's definitely tough, especially with those guys not playing, because it's hard to really evaluate. I know Chandler Parsons too is going to play. I think in now. So what do you think about his situation with the Grizzlies?
It's a mess, and it's sort of the TMZ sideshow of the Grizzlies season right now. Like if you make a list, like with the spiel I just gave you was sort of like ticking off what matters from a basketball standpoint. And yet Parsons is the thing that sort of looms larger than any of that, even if it's sort of least important, really, from a basketball standpoint. The reality is that, Parsons has 1 year left in this deal for, I think, about $24 million next season, fully guaranteed.
Oh, my.
It is unlikely that anything he does over the next 2 months changes his status as, in terms of whatever the end game is for that. It's probably not dependent on what he does on the floor. It's a contract thing at this point, right? So, can they find some trade this summer with his, soon to be expiring contract that is worth doing? I think probably not. If they can't, do they buy him out this summer, or do they carry him into next season with the idea of we'll have a $24 million expiring contract next February, and that will be a major trade chip? I think that's the decision making that's going to happen with Chandler Parsons. And if they feel like from a basketball standpoint, carrying that contract into next season is the smart thing to do, can the relationship hold up to the point that you're even willing to do that, right? Because he hates the front office and the front office hates him, and it became more of a mess than it needed to be, really. At the time he started squawking about wanting to play, which was around Christmas, right after Christmas. It happened to be at a moment, really the only moment all season, and this is what's not true before and has not been true since. He started squawking about playing time publicly at a moment where every other player on the roster was healthy. Michael Green had come back from injury. Dylan Brooks had come back from injury. Everyone was healthy. And so he started squawking about, put me back on the floor. And my question was, like, in front of who? Like, who's sitting down for you right now? If he had just been patient and he just stewed behind the scenes, then 2 weeks later, the more injuries would have hit, which they did, and they probably would have put him out on the floor. From the Grizzlies standpoint, like, they were stubborn about it. They probably should have just said, okay, you're active, it's up to the coach, whatever. They didn't do that for whatever reason. To me, it was a sign of not trusting their coaching staff, which I think was a bigger story, Chandler Parsons' story. Instead, they basically tried to get him to go away. I mean, they said, okay, we're not going to play you. You can go to the G League and prove it. And he didn't want to do that. So they said, okay, we'll send you home. And then it became a mess. And I think there's a good chance he would still be in California today if the Anthony Davis situation hadn't happened. I think the NBA apparently foreseen or exerting some level of influence on Anthony Davis taking the floor for New Orleans after the trade deadline. I think that was somewhat of an impetus for Chandler Parsons' return.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree, because I feel like, and it's weird because, in previous NBA situations, I remember the Pacers telling Jamal Tinsley like 10 years ago to just stay home, and they didn't play him for like 2 years left on his contract. So it sort of changed a lot now, where I think the Anthony Davis thing, like especially players who are, a player of Anthony Davis's caliber, is the league is going to want to, but it also does give players like Chandler the power to say, hey, I want to play, I want to prove. Because I think for him, it also is in his best interest because he wants to prove to people that he can stay on the court. But obviously, there are questions because every time he comes back, he's injured or he.
Well, I think he wants at some point for the Grizzlies to buy him out. And when that happens, he wants to be able to sign somewhere else. And so, you want to prove you can still play enough that someone will be willing to give you another contract, even if it's a minimum, even if it's, Joakim Noah, who was sort of here with the Grizzlies, went through that with New York, right? And so he wants to get out of the situation in Memphis, much as Joakim Noah got out of the situation in New York, but he wants to be able to turn that into playing somewhere else.
Yeah. And so I guess the final piece to this, that I really haven't talked about is Mike Conley. And I mean, you mentioned it already, just that he's probably going to be traded and his, future with the team is probably over, most likely as they, hit the full reset button. He's handled it really well. And I think like some of the quotes that he's given about, having to think about being traded and sort of just how he's ready to give back to Jaren Jackson, just like other veterans gave back to him when they went through the first rebuild and traded Pau Gasol. I thought they were really interesting. I mean, what is it like covering somebody like that who's just very like even keel about everything he handles, every situation, something like this, which is really hard for a veteran player who's been on one franchise forever, to be traded like that.
It was funny that whole, grind core of him and Marc and Tony Allen and Zach Randolph. It was a real. I described it as sort of a Freudian balance, right? I mean, you had Zach Randolph and especially Tony Allen, who was sort of the edge, just this rampaging sort of instinct, sort of this particular energy that they had. And Marc Gasol, who like publicly agonizes all the time about everything, was a counterbalance to that. And then Mike Conley was sort of the mediator, right? And one of his nicknames was the conductor. I mean, he sort of balanced all of that. He was sort of the quiet, soft-spoken, sort of calming presence among these three much more difficult personalities and much more flamboyant personalities. And so Mike was sort of the, more of the calming influence. But partly for that reason, it is sort of harder to really tell where he's really at. With Gasol, it's pretty easy. Like Gasol, I mean, you can see it on the floor, you can see it in the locker room. Like, Gasol doesn't have much of a poker face. Conley is able to sort of keep it in check a little bit more, so it's a little bit harder to tell what he really wants. Like at the end, Gasol clearly was like, "Okay, I'm done with this. Let's go." And it was not clear totally with Conley even now. My suspicion is that he would prefer probably to move this summer if he can move to a good situation. But it is not as transparent as it was with Gasol at the end. And so we'll see sort of where that goes. My suspicion is, I think with Gasol, in terms of the trade deadline, I think it got to the point with Gasol where the Grizzlies decided, okay, we're trading Marc Gasol. We're going to get the best deal we can, and we're going to take whatever the best deal is. With Conley, they had a certain threshold they were going to need to get to move him. It was a fairly high threshold, and they were willing to not move him if they didn't get it, and that turned out to not be a bluff. And so they didn't get it. They didn't move him. And I think the idea was we'll revisit this in the summer, and we think there will be better deals to be had around the draft or maybe into free agency when you have, when the musical chairs happens in free agency and you have a lot of teams with money to spend and not as many players, and someone will come up short, and then is trading for Mike Conley with 2 years left better than overspending, in a 4-year deal on some second-tier free agent. So I think they feel like there will be better trade options for them in the summer. But I don't know if they are 100% committed to trading Mike Conley this summer. I think it's likely, but, I think this pick they owe Boston is a real complicating factor. I mean, let's say you get the number one pick in the draft. You get lucky. You get the number one pick. You got Zion and you got Jaren Jackson Jr., and at that point, you still owe Boston a first-round pick. At that point, it'll be top 6 protected in 2020, unprotected in 2021. If you have Jaren Jackson and Zion Williamson, what's your decision? Is it, well, we don't care about the pick we owe at this point. We got our 2 cornerstones. Let's trade Mike Conley and get on with our rebuild. Or is it, you know what? These 2 young forwards would be served by having a good veteran point guard, to help bring them along. And we want to be kind of good because we don't want to give Boston a high pick. And is that an incentive to keep Mike Conley? Whereas, let's say you're good enough, you fall out of the top 8 this summer, and you convey your pick to Boston this summer. At that point, you say, we might as well trade Mike Conley, and we'll just be really bad next season because we don't have to worry about Boston. We'll get on with our rebuild. So I think it's likely you'll see a trade this summer, but I do feel like what happens in the draft, one way or another, will influence that decision.
Yeah, I think it will. And it sort of influenced what they've been doing the past couple of years in terms of trying to be competitive up until, things fell apart. Like Conley's injury and then them going on the rough losing patch earlier this season. So I guess as a final point, I just wanted to say I really loved your article about the last man standing piece about Mike Conley and sort of after the Gasol trade. The part that really stood out to me was the locker room situation in post game when you spoke to Gasol and you asked him after he hit a big 3 against the Indiana Pacers. That they won. It was pretty much the 3 that sealed the game for them. You asked him if he was going to pop it or rip it, which was, is he going to pop his jersey, pop his collar? Is he going to rip his jersey?
Which he's done before, by the way. There was history there. He has ripped his jersey in a game before.
Oh, wait, he had? Actually, I don't even remember. When has he done? Does he do it a lot, or has it?
No, he did it. Darko did it once. And years ago, after Grizzlies, Darko Milicic did it, and then Gasol did it one time after that, and he sort of joked that it was like an homage to Darko. This was several years ago. So when I asked him that question, there was history there. Like he really could have done either.
Yeah, and so he said, I was going to pop it, and he said, I thought it said Memphis, but when I looked down, it said Grizzlies. I thought we were wearing the white uniforms with Memphis on the front, and I wanted to pop it, but when I saw Grizzlies... and then you said, then he sort of raised his eyebrows in a shrug and headed out. That was really interesting to me. That really stood out. Just how much his relationship with Memphis, the city, he can compartmentalize that and differentiate that from his relationship with the Grizzlies as a franchise. I thought that was just really, really key piece in just sort of his trade situation, that he's always going to love Memphis from his time growing up as a teenager. And I think an adolescent, up until, now. And so, it really stood out to me just because of the situation. Do you think he came away feeling, I don't want to say bad blood, but, he came out not on the best terms with the Grizzlies, franchise?
Oh, I think that was true. To me, what was striking about that is not that he drew that distinction, but he drew it in the heat of the moment. Like in the actual moment, he sort of made that distinction. And I didn't know he was going to say that when I asked him that question, but I knew something was going on because I've watched him so much over the years. I tend to watch him pretty closely, and I tend to ask him about some of that kind of stuff after games because there's a performative aspect to him in games that I think is interesting. And so I knew when I noticed him reach his hands up and then stop, I knew there was something in his head. I didn't know what it was. I was sort of surprised he told me that. But, to me, what was interesting is that he drew that distinction immediately. Not that he had. I knew he sort of had that distinction at that moment. I think he left. I think there was bitterness towards the organization when he left. I don't think that will last. In fact, I bet it's probably over already. I think it was more of a heat of the moment in that week, right?
Yeah.
I think he resented. He resented that it went public and I think in his mind, and I sort of said this earlier, but to me in his mind early in that process, he thought, we'll deal with this summer. Like, we'll play out this season and then we'll get together this summer. And if it had gone to the summer, with his player option, he sort of would have had control of the process. I think he would have ended up leaving, whether that was via trade or some opt out. But I think in his mind, the Grizzlies sort of took his control away. Now, I also think he's probably happy with the result. I think he's happy to be in a playoff race. I think Toronto is probably a place he's happy to be. The kind of person he is, I would imagine Toronto is a place, as cosmopolitan as he is. I think Toronto is a good place for him, both as a player and as a person. So I suspect he's happy with the result. I just think he got pretty emotional about sort of the whole process of it being publicly known that the team was trading him. And so I do think there was sort of some hard feelings at the end, but I suspect those are probably already gone.
Yeah. And final question, since this is the NBA Trades podcast, I have to ask you, In the Grizzlies franchise history, I guess we'll keep it to the Memphis part. What is the trade that stands out to you the most in your mind from the time that the Grizzlies came to Memphis in 2001 up until now? What is the trade that comes to your mind first?
I'll give you two because one of them's a little boring because we've already talked about it a little bit. But what they're living right now is that they owe this pick to Boston.
Oh yeah,
and it is a trade. They traded for Jeff Green. And so it was a mistake twice over. A, they shouldn't have traded for Jeff Green. I think they should have known better at that point. But B, the real mistake was not just trading for Jeff Green. It was not negotiating a better outcome. I think they were so convinced that they would be good enough, to convey that pick, and it not hurt them that much that they didn't, that should never have been a pick that would ever become unprotected. That should have been something that would, the protections would lower and then it became 2 seconds, right? The idea that you would trade a pick that would ever become an unprotected pick for Jeff Green is sort of preposterous, I think. So that's the ankle around their neck. The other one that just happens to come to mind for whatever reason was Jerry West. I think, making a mistake and recognizing it very early. He picked Drew Gooden with the 4th pick in the draft, proclaimed him the next James Worthy on draft night, and then 3 months into the season, he flipped him to Orlando for Mike Miller. Mike Miller ended up becoming one of the better and more beloved players in franchise history. Won the 6th Man of the Year with the Grizzlies, came back for a second stint late in his career during the grit grind years, and actually after his playing career was over, moved back to Memphis. Decided, from North Dakota or South Dakota, from somewhere in that area, played all over the NBA. Played in Florida, Miami, played in Orlando, played in Denver. And when his career was over, he decided, I want my family in Memphis, and just moved here to live his life. And is now the assistant coach for Penny Hardaway on the University of Memphis Tigers. And none of that would have happened if Jerry West hadn't decided, I made a mistake on Drew Gooden. Let's trade him while I can and get value for him.
Oh,
so
wow.
That comes to mind.
Yeah, I never thought about that. And, that trade is really interesting to me just because, they put Drew Gooden as a 3 and with Gasol and Lorenzen, right? And to me, it never, I mean, I was researching it. Yeah. Yeah. What were you going to say?
And Stromile Smith, too.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a front line, a very big front line. I know Drew Gooden was very unhappy about being a 3. He was a 4 in college and a 5 too at times in college. Right. So for him, but that's a really key trade, and just sort of you connecting that with the Mike Miller thing. The other one, yeah, like you mentioning the Jeff Green for Lance Stevenson. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. That they ended up trading Jeff Green after, the trade you mentioned. And that they ended up trading for Lance Stevenson, and sort of just the connection of the Celtics trade giving up Jeff Green and the Grizzlies giving up a first round pick in that 3-team trade with Boston and New Orleans. A lot of connecting parts and a lot of things happening, but I guess we'll see what happens with the Grizzlies and their first round pick, that future first round pick.
So here's some Jeff Green for you. So if the Grizzlies fall out of the top 8, Boston will get a pick from the Grizzlies. That was in a Jeff Green trade, right? That was the pick they traded for Jeff Green. If the Celtics get the Clippers pick in this draft, that will be a pick they actually got from the Grizzlies, and the Grizzlies got it from the Clippers for Jeff Green.
Wow. That's that's really, that's what I was thinking too. I didn't really explain what, but yeah, that's crazy, right? Isn't that crazy that,
yeah,
it just sort of is all connected?
The Celtics could have 2 first-round picks from other teams this summer that both essentially were part of Jeff Green trades.
Yeah, and I think we've all realized that Jeff Green is better as a minimum contract player. He's a great value as what he is right now in the NBA the past 2 years with Washington and Cleveland. But as a guy you trade a first round pick for, or you offer a 4-year or 5-year contract to, I think you should probably pass. But this has been the NBA Trades Podcast. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate, your insight on the Grizzlies and just sort of a really interesting time and a change in identity for this franchise and where they're going to be headed in the future. Thanks so much for speaking.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This has been another edition of the NBA Trades Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter, NBA_trades. Like the page on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast. It's on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube. And I think that's it. So check it out, subscribe, rate and review. Really appreciate it, and take care.